The first time I saw Autumn, she was counting exits, not looking at the teacher, not looking at the other students staring at her like she was some kind of exhibit. Her eyes moved across the room in a slow line. Door, window, door, vent, like she was building a map inside her skull. I remember thinking it was strange. Everyone else on the first day of a new class looks at faces. She looked at ways out. My name is Milo, and I am not from Earth. Nobody in that classroom was, except her. Our academy sits on a station built for 100 different species, and every one of us had grown up somewhere soft, somewhere safe. Our worlds had long ago stopped trying to kill us. Predators were extinct or fenced off behind glass and law. Weather was managed. Disease was a memory taught in history class, not a thing you lived through. Autumn came from a place the codex listed under a single flat word: Deathworld. I had read that entry twice before she ever walked in, and both times I laughed a little, the way you laugh at something you don't understand. The file said her planet had gravity heavier than ours, weather that could kill in an afternoon, animals built like walking blades, and diseases that evolved faster than her people could name them. It said humans had survived there anyway, not thrived in comfort, survived. I did not believe it. Not really. You read a fact like that and it stays a fact, flat and far away, until it stands in your doorway wearing a school uniform 2 sizes too big and looking at your classroom like it might still be trying to kill her. She sat in the back corner, the seat closest to the door. Nobody had claimed it before because it was the least desirable seat, too far from the projector, too close to the noise of the hallway. She took it without asking anyone, without hesitation, and I understood later that she had chosen it on purpose. She always chose the seat nearest to an exit. I did not know that yet. I only knew it felt odd, the way she moved like she was still walking through a place with teeth. Our species, the Thren, communicate partly through scent and posture, layered under our words. It means I can feel a room shift before anyone speaks. That first morning, I felt the room shift toward her, like a held breath. Curiosity, mostly. A little fear, because humans were new to us, and new things make people nervous even when they smell harmless. And under all of that, something sharper, something I would only later understand, was contempt. The kind you feel for something you have decided, without evidence, is beneath you. The teacher, Professor Lang, was a tall being with silver eyes and a voice like still water. He introduced Autumn the way you introduce a fact in a textbook. This is Autumn. She comes from a planet classified as high risk. She will be joining our class for the semester. Please make her feel welcome. Nobody made her feel welcome, a few students whispered. One boy near the front, a broad-shouldered student named Garrick, from a species built for open combat on their homeworld generations ago, before their world went soft too, snorted loud enough for half the room to hear. He said something about how funny it was that the weakest species in the sector had sent someone here to learn from the rest of us. A few students laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Autumn did not react. She did not flinch, did not look down, did not look angry. She looked at Garrick the way you look at weather on a screen, something to note and then move past. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Not what she did, but what she didn't do. On every world I knew, when someone insults you in front of a room, your body answers before your mind can stop it. Hers did nothing. She simply turned back to her console and began taking notes. I sat 2 rows over, close enough to watch her without seeming to. I noticed things across that first week that I filed away without understanding why they mattered. She never sat with her back to the door. When the ventilation system clicked on with its low mechanical hum, half the room ignored it, and she went still for exactly 1 second, listening, before returning to her work, like she was confirming the sound was not a threat, before allowing herself to relax. When a heavy case fell off a shelf in the science wing and cracked against the floor, 3 students jumped and yelped. Autumn's hand was already halfway to her side before she caught herself, before she seemed to remember where she was, and slowly let it drop back to the table. Nobody else saw it. I saw it because I was watching her. At lunch, she sat alone. Not because anyone told her to, because nobody sat with her, and she did not seem to expect them to. I watched her eat with the careful, economical motion of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, never to waste food or time. She finished quickly and quietly, and spent the rest of the break with her eyes half closed, resting, the way you rest when you have learned that rest is not something you are owed, but something you take the moment it is offered. I wanted to talk to her. I did not yet. Something about her made the other students keep their distance, and I told myself it was because I did not want to draw Garrick's attention. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she made me uneasy in a way I could not name. Not because she seemed dangerous, because she seemed calm in a way none of us were built to be calm, and calm like that usually comes from somewhere none of us had ever had to go. By the end of the first week, the class had settled into a rhythm around her. She answered questions when called on, precise and short, never volunteering more than asked. She did not raise her hand to speak about herself, did not talk about her homeworld, unless a teacher directly asked, and even then her answers were brief, almost clipped, like she was handing over facts rather than memories. Where other students bragged about their homeworlds, their technology, their comforts, Autumn offered only small, flat sentences. It rains there, the winters are long, you learn to move fast. Garrick did not let it go. He was the kind of student who needed an audience, and Autumn's silence seemed to bother him more than any argument could have. He started small. Comments dropped just loud enough for her to hear as she passed his desk. Jokes about fragile little earth animals wandering into a real classroom. A few of his friends laughed along, the easy laughter of people who enjoy being on the comfortable side of a joke. Autumn never answered him. She would glance at him for half a second, the same flat, cataloging look she'd given him on the first day, and then go back to whatever she was doing. I began to notice that her silence unsettled him more than shouting ever could have. People like Garrick expect a reaction. They are built for confrontation that goes somewhere. Autumn gave him nothing to push against, and I could see, even in someone from a species not built to read human faces easily, that this made him angrier every single day. I finally spoke to her near the end of that second week, in the quiet stretch of hallway between the science wing and the courtyard. I asked her, clumsily, why she never sat with her back to a door. I expected her to be surprised that I had noticed. She wasn't. She looked at me for a moment, weighing something, and then said, simply, that on her world, the thing that got you was never the thing you were looking at. It was always the thing behind you. She said it the way someone else might say, the weather looks like rain today. No drama in it, no performance, just a fact she had learned early and never unlearned. I did not know what to say to that. I remember standing there while she walked away toward her next class and thinking that I had misread her completely. I had thought she was quiet because she was afraid, because our world was loud and strange and full of species who did not know how fragile she was supposed to be. But watching her walk down that hallway, spine straight, steps even, eyes flicking once toward every doorway she passed, I understood for the first time that I had the sentence backward. She was not the one who needed protecting in that room. I just did not know yet how far that truth would go, or how soon the rest of the class would learn it too. The third week was when Garrick stopped using words and started using his hands. It happened in the hallway outside the physical sciences lab, in the loud crush of bodies moving between classes. I was a few steps behind Autumn when I saw him step into her path, not by accident, his shoulder catching hers hard enough to spin her half a step sideways. Her tray of equipment, glass measuring tools borrowed for a lab assignment, hit the floor and shattered into bright, useless pieces. He laughed. Not alone. Two of his friends laughed with him, the kind of laughter that exists only to be heard by the person it is aimed at. He said something about Deathworld reflexes not being so quick after all, and asked her, loud enough for half the hallway to hear, if she needed help picking up her mess, since apparently she couldn't handle simple things without breaking them. Autumn knelt and gathered the broken glass with steady hands. Piece by piece, placing each one carefully into the tray so nothing would cut her fingers. She did not look up at him. She did not answer him. When she was done, she stood, tray in hand, and walked past him toward the lab without a single word. I felt something twist in my chest watching that. Not quite anger, something closer to shame, the kind you feel when you watch something wrong happen and do nothing but stand there. I told myself I would have stepped in if I thought it would help. I am not sure that was true. Garrick was larger than most of the class, built by his species for a kind of physical confidence none of the rest of us carried, and confronting him directly had never worked out well for anyone who tried. What surprised me was that Autumn never reported him. Professor Lang asked, later that day, what had happened to the equipment, and she said only that it had been an accident, that she had dropped it herself. I watched her say it, calm and flat, and I understood that she was not protecting Garrick. She simply did not think the incident was worth the trouble of explaining. On her world, I imagine, broken glass was the smallest kind of problem there was. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Garrick, I came to realize over the following days, was not a boy who let quiet defiance go unanswered. Her silence, which should have ended the conflict, seemed instead to feed something in him. He needed her to react. He needed to see fear cross her face, needed some proof that the hierarchy he had grown up believing in, strong species above weak ones, still held true even here, even with her. Every day that she failed to give him that reaction, his need to force it out of her grew a little sharper. He began finding smaller ways to needle her, nudging her chair when he passed, knocking books from the edge of her desk as if by accident. Once he leaned over during a group project and told her, quiet enough that only she and I could hear, that everyone in the room secretly thought her homeworld had made a mistake sending someone so breakable to represent them, that she was an embarrassment to whatever crawling, struggling species had produced her. I watched her face when he said that. For just a moment, something moved behind her eyes, not anger exactly, something older and heavier, like a door opening onto a room she usually kept locked. Then it was gone, and her expression settled back into that same flat calm, and she went back to her work as if he had said nothing at all. I asked her about it afterward, in the same quiet hallway where we had first spoken. I asked her why she let him talk to her like that, why she never pushed back. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice was lower than usual, almost tired. She told me that where she came from, the loudest threat in the room was rarely the one that killed you. The things that killed people on her world did not announce themselves. They did not posture or brag or need an audience. They simply waited, patient and silent, until the moment was right. She said Garrick reminded her of the animals back home that made the most noise, the ones that puffed themselves up and postured because they had learned that most creatures would back down before a fight ever had to happen. She said the quiet ones were always more dangerous, and that she had learned a long time ago not to waste her energy on the loud ones unless they actually became a genuine threat. I asked her, half joking, half serious, what she considered a genuine threat. She looked at me for a long moment, and there was something almost gentle in her expression when she answered, something that made the question feel heavier than I had intended it. She said a genuine threat was something that could actually end your life. And then she said, quietly, that nothing in this school had come close to that yet. I did not understand, at the time, how carefully she had chosen that word. Yet. The rest of that week passed in an uneasy rhythm. Garrick's friends began joining in more openly, egging him on, treating Autumn's silence as an invitation rather than a boundary. I started noticing something else too, something that made the unease in my chest grow heavier each day. Autumn had begun watching Garrick the way she watched doorways, cataloging him, measuring the distance between them when he was near, the position of his hands, the way his weight shifted before he moved. I did not understand what I was seeing then. I only knew that whatever calm restraint she was holding on to, it was not the same as ignorance. She was not failing to notice the danger building around her. She was choosing, deliberately, not to answer it yet. The turning point, though I did not recognize it as one at the time, came on a day when Garrick's frustration finally outran his patience entirely. It was during a free period in the courtyard, students scattered across benches and open grass under the artificial sky the station projected overhead. Autumn was sitting alone, as she always did, a small case of tools open beside her, working on some kind of personal project, a little mechanical device she had been quietly building between classes. Garrick approached with two of his friends trailing behind him, the three of them moving with the loose, confident swagger of boys who had never once in their lives been made to feel small. He stopped in front of her and knocked the device from her hands with the back of his wrist, sending pieces scattering across the grass. I was close enough to hear what he said next, and it was worse than anything he had said before. He told her that her whole species was an accident, that any world that produced something as fragile and slow as humanity did not deserve a seat among the rest of us, and that she should go back to her dying rock of a planet before someone here decided to teach her exactly how weak she really was. Autumn went very still. Not frightened still, something else. A stillness like a held breath before a storm, like the moment right before weather turns. She looked up at him, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something close to genuine attention in her eyes, the kind of focus a predator gives something it has finally decided is worth its notice. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She simply said, in a tone so calm it was almost gentle, that he had no idea what weak actually meant, and that he should be grateful for that, because the day he found out would be a very bad day for him. Garrick laughed, but it sounded thinner than before, and I noticed, with a small jolt of surprise, that one of his friends had stopped laughing entirely and taken a half-step back. Something had shifted in that courtyard, something none of us could name yet, but all of us could feel. The joke had stopped being funny to at least one person in that little crowd, and I remember thinking, walking away from that scene with my pulse strangely fast for no reason I could explain, that whatever line Autumn had drawn for herself, Garrick was walking toward it with every single day that passed. None of us knew yet how close that line actually was, or what would happen the day he finally crossed it. The morning it happened started like any other, which is exactly why none of us saw it coming. We were in Professor Lang's afternoon class, the same room where Autumn had first sat counting exits weeks earlier. The lesson that day was on cooperative survival strategies across different worlds, an ordinary subject, the kind of thing meant to build understanding between species who had grown up in wildly different conditions. Professor Lang had asked for volunteers to describe how their homeworlds handled danger, expecting the usual answers about advanced technology, weather shields, automated safety systems. Garrick answered first, describing his people's ancient combat traditions with obvious pride, framing them as proof of strength, even though his own species had not faced real danger in generations. A few other students spoke after him, offering similar stories, comfortable stories, the kind that come from worlds where danger is a memory rather than a daily companion. Then Professor Lang turned to Autumn. I felt the room shift, the way it always did when attention landed on her, that mixture of curiosity and quiet unease. She did not stand. She answered from her seat in that same flat, economical voice she used for everything, and said that on her world, survival was not a strategy you learned in a lesson. It was something you carried with you every single day, because the day you forgot it was usually the day you did not get another chance to remember. Professor Lang, sensing something worth drawing out, asked her to elaborate. Autumn hesitated, the first real hesitation I had ever seen from her, and then said that her planet's gravity was heavier than ours, its storms could level buildings without warning, and its wildlife did not distinguish between curiosity and hunger. She said her people had not tamed their world. They had simply learned to survive inside it, generation after generation, and that the ones who forgot how quickly things could turn dangerous rarely lived long enough to teach anyone else. The room had gone quiet in a way it had never gone quiet for her before. For the first time since she arrived, I felt something in the air that was not contempt or curiosity, but something closer to respect, small and uncertain, but real. Garrick could not let that stand. He stood from his seat, loud enough that his chair scraped hard against the floor, and said, in a voice pitched for the whole room, that it was easy to talk about danger when nobody could prove any of it, that for all we knew, she was exaggerating her whole planet just to sound impressive in front of people who actually mattered. He said humans probably spent their whole lives being scared of shadows and calling it survival, and that real danger was something his species had faced and conquered generations ago, something a fragile little human girl couldn't possibly understand. Autumn did not answer him. She simply looked at him, the same flat, cataloging look, and turned back toward Professor Lang as if the interruption had not happened at all. That silence was what broke him. I did not see exactly where the blade came from. Later, campus security would find it had been smuggled in from an off-station market, a compact folding knife, small enough to hide in a sleeve, sharp enough that its presence alone made half the room go rigid with fear the instant it appeared in his hand. Garrick crossed the space between his desk and hers in 3 quick strides, and he held the blade up where everyone could see it, close enough to Autumn's face that a few students actually screamed. He was shouting something about proving a point, about showing everyone what real fear looked like, about how she would finally understand what a real threat was, instead of just talking about the ones back on her precious Deathworld. His friends, who moments before had been laughing along with him, now looked frozen, pale, clearly realizing that whatever line existed between a joke and something dangerous had just been crossed in front of the entire class. Professor Lang shouted for him to stop, took a step forward, and froze himself when Garrick's hand jerked in warning, the blade catching the light. I remember my own heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, my body locked in place the way prey freezes when a predator gets too close, every instinct screaming at me to do something while every part of me stayed rooted to the floor, useless. And then I looked at Autumn. She was not frozen. She was not afraid. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Garrick's hand, on the blade, on the small tremor in his grip that betrayed just how far outside his depth he actually was. And slowly, terribly, unmistakably, the corner of her mouth curved upward into a grin. It was not a cruel grin. It was not even an angry one. It was the kind of grin I imagine a much older, much more dangerous creature might wear when something small and loud finally wandered close enough to be dealt with. It was the grin of someone who had spent her whole life learning exactly what real danger looked like, and had just realized, with something like relief, that this was not it. Garrick, emboldened by her stillness, leaned closer, jabbing the air near her with the blade for emphasis, demanding she admit that she was scared, that her whole Deathworld reputation was nothing but a story, that she was exactly as fragile as the rest of us. Autumn tilted her head, slow and deliberate, studying him the way you might study something small and irritating that had wandered too close. Then she spoke, and her voice was calm enough that it somehow carried through the whole silent room without needing to be raised at all. She told him that where she came from, a blade held that clumsily, that close, by someone whose hand was shaking that badly, would not be considered a threat. It would be considered an opportunity. Garrick's confusion lasted less than half a second. That was all the time Autumn needed. Her hand moved before most of us even registered that she had moved at all, a blur of motion so fast and so controlled that it did not look like violence so much as it looked like something rehearsed 1,000 times over, something worn smooth by repetition until it had become as natural as breathing. Her fingers closed around his wrist and twisted, redirecting the blade's angle away from her in the same motion that swept his balance out from under him. He staggered, off balance, his whole body suddenly betraying him in ways his confidence had never prepared him for, and before he could recover, Autumn's other hand had already found the joints of his fingers, applying pressure precise enough to make the blade clatter uselessly to the floor without ever once threatening to break anything. He went down to one knee, more from shock than pain, his face a mixture of confusion and something close to fear, the same fear he had been trying so hard to force onto her only seconds before. The whole exchange had taken less time than it takes to draw a single breath. The room was utterly silent. Even the ambient hum of the station's ventilation seemed too loud in the stillness that followed. Every student sat frozen, staring at the scene in front of them, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Professor Lang stood halfway between his desk and the confrontation, hand still half raised from where he had tried to intervene, clearly as stunned as the rest of us. Autumn released Garrick's wrist and stepped back, unhurried, completely calm, as though she had simply finished tying her shoe rather than disarmed a classmate who had pulled a weapon on her in the middle of a lesson. She bent, picked up the fallen knife with 2 careful fingers, and walked it over to Professor Lang, holding it out to him handle first, the way you might hand someone a dropped pen. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, was quiet, but it filled the whole room anyway. She said that she was sorry the lesson had gotten interrupted, and then, glancing once at Garrick, still kneeling on the floor, cradling his wrist and staring up at her like he had never truly seen her before that moment, she added, softly, that where she came from, this would not even count as a close call. Nobody in that room laughed. Nobody made a single joke about Deathworld reflexes ever again. Security arrived within minutes, alerted by Professor Lang the instant he had recovered enough to move. 2 officers from the Academy's Small Enforcement Division escorted Garrick out of the classroom, one of them carrying the confiscated blade sealed inside a clear evidence pouch. He did not resist. He did not say a single word. The confidence that had carried him through every hallway of that school for years had simply gone out of him, like a light switched off, and what remained looked smaller than I had ever imagined he could look. Professor Lang dismissed the rest of us early, his voice unsteady in a way none of us had ever heard from him before. Students filed out of the room in near total silence, casting glances at Autumn that were nothing like the glances she had received on her first day. There was no more curiosity dressed up as mockery, no more contempt hiding behind soft laughter. What I saw on their faces now was something closer to caution, and underneath the caution, something that looked almost like awe. Autumn gathered her things calmly, sliding her console and stylus back into her bag with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything else. I lingered near the door, unsure whether to say anything at all, unsure whether there were words that fit a moment like this one. She noticed me watching and did not look away. I asked her, my voice quieter than I intended, if she was all right. She looked faintly surprised by the question, as though it had not occurred to her that anyone would need to ask. She said she was fine, that it had not even come close to a real emergency, and that on her world, a threat like that would barely have registered as worth remembering by the end of the same day. I asked her, carefully, how she had done it. Not the mechanics of it, though those had been extraordinary enough on their own, but how she had stayed so calm, how she had turned a blade pointed at her face into something she handled with less visible effort than tying a knot. She was quiet, for a long moment, considering the question the way she considered most things, weighing it, before offering an answer. She said that calm was not something she had been born with. It was something her world had built into her, piece by piece, the same way it built endurance into every creature that survived there long enough to grow up. She said that back home, panic got you killed faster than almost anything else. It slowed your hands, clouded your judgment, made you hesitate in the exact moment. Hesitation was the one thing you could not afford. So her people learned, from the time they were small children, to feel fear without letting it control their bodies, to let their hands stay steady even while their heart pounded. She said it was not bravery, not really. It was simply what happened when an entire species had no other choice. I asked her what her world had actually been like, growing up. I expected another short, clipped answer, the kind she usually gave when the subject turned personal. Instead, she paused, glancing out the classroom window at the artificial sky projected above the station, and said that her earliest memory was of her mother teaching her to identify which plants near their home were safe to touch, and which ones would put you in a medical unit for a week if your skin so much as brushed against them. She said she had been 4 years old. She told me that where she came from, Children were taught to run before they were taught to read, because running kept you alive long enough to need reading in the first place. She said storms on her world could flatten homes with almost no warning, and families built their houses low and sturdy and close to shelters they could reach within seconds, because seconds were sometimes all you got. She said the wildlife on her planet did not fear humans the way animals on gentler worlds feared people. On her world, humans were simply another creature in the food chain, sometimes prey, sometimes not, depending entirely on how prepared you were in the moment it mattered. I asked her, hesitantly, if she had ever actually been hurt, out there, before she came here. Something in her expression shifted then, something quieter and heavier than anything I had seen from her before, even in the moment with Garrick's blade inches from her face. She did not answer directly. She only said that everyone on her world carried marks of some kind, visible or otherwise, and that the ones who didn't carry any marks at all were usually the ones who hadn't lived long enough to earn them. I did not push further. I understood, somehow, that I had reached the edge of something she was not ready to hand over yet, and that pushing past that edge would cost more than it was worth. Instead, I asked her something simpler. I asked her why she had come here at all, to a school full of soft, safe species who had spent generations forgetting what real danger even looked like. If her world had shaped her into someone this capable, this composed under pressure that would have broken any of the rest of us completely, why leave it behind for a place like this? For the first time since I had known her, something like a real smile crossed her face, small and tired, but genuine. She said that her people had not sent her here because Earth needed to prove anything to the rest of the galaxy. They had sent her here because they were tired of surviving alone. She said her homeworld had spent so many centuries fighting simply to exist that they had never had the luxury of building the kind of peace the rest of us took for granted, and that being here, in a place where danger was rare enough to be shocking rather than routine, was not something she resented. It was something she found, in a strange and complicated way, beautiful. She said she had grown up dreaming about a world where a knife pulled in a classroom would be shocking enough to freeze an entire room in horror, rather than just another Tuesday. I did not know how to respond to that. I only knew that the girl standing in front of me, the one who had disarmed a fully grown, physically dominant classmate in less time than it takes to blink, was not fearless, because she did not understand fear. She was calm because she understood it more completely than any of us ever had, and had simply refused to let it decide who she became. Word of what happened spread through the academy faster than any lesson ever could. By the time the next day's classes began, every student on the station seemed to know some version of the story, though most versions had already grown strange in the retelling, exaggerated into something closer to legend than fact. What stayed consistent through every version, though, was the ending. The Deathworld girl had grinned when the blade came out, and by the time it was over, the boy who had pulled it was the one who looked afraid. I found myself walking beside her more often after that, not because she needed protection, that idea now seemed almost laughable, but because I wanted to understand more about the world that had built someone like her. She remained quiet about most of it, careful with her words the way someone is careful with something they know can wound if handled wrong. But little by little, she let a few more details through. A story about the winter her family's shelter had nearly failed during a storm that lasted 3 days. A description of the strange, resilient plants her people had learned to cultivate in soil that fought them at every turn. Small pieces of a much larger, harder story that she was only beginning to trust any of us with. I understood, walking beside her through the quiet corridors of a station built for comfort, that the galaxy had misjudged her people the same way I had misjudged her on that very first day. We had looked at humanity's simple technology, their late arrival among the stars, their fragile-looking bodies, and decided that fragile was the whole truth. We had never stopped to ask what it actually took to survive a world that offered no mercy at all, generation after generation, until survival itself became something closer to an art form. Garrick was gone from our class within the week, transferred elsewhere pending review, and nobody spoke his name in that room again. But the space he left behind was filled with something new, something that had not existed in that classroom before Autumn arrived, a kind of quiet respect that did not need to be demanded because it had already been earned in the space of a few unforgettable seconds. I did not know it then, but the story was not finished. The codex entry that had first told me my classmate came from a Deathworld, the same entry I had once read and quietly dismissed as exaggeration, was about to be rewritten, and Autumn was about to teach the rest of us a lesson far larger than anything Professor Lang had ever planned for that classroom. 3 weeks after the incident, the Academy's council called a review, the kind of formal proceeding that happened whenever an event on station raised questions bigger than a single classroom could answer. I was not required to attend, but Autumn asked me to come sit with her beforehand, and I did not hesitate. The council chamber was colder than our usual classrooms, all polished metal and hard light, built for judgment rather than comfort. Representatives from several species sat along a raised curve of seats, and at the center of the floor stood a projection of the codex entry on humanity, the same flat, dismissive classification I had read on Autumn's very first day. High risk, fragile, newly contacted, limited technological development relative to established codex members. One of the council representatives, an elder from a species known for long, careful deliberation, asked Autumn to describe, in her own words, what had happened that day in Professor Lang's classroom. She did not embellish. She described the confrontation the same way she described everything, plainly, without emotion, laying out the facts as though she were reading a report rather than reliving a memory. When she was finished, the elder asked her a question that made the whole room go still. The elder asked whether she believed her reaction that day was unusual for a human, or whether it reflected something ordinary for her people, something the codex had simply failed to record. Autumn was quiet for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice carried further than I expected in that cold, echoing room. She said that what she had done was not remarkable on her world. It was simply what happened when someone posed a genuine threat and gave you no other option. She said humans were not naturally violent, not eager for confrontation, not looking for chances to prove themselves the way some of the stories already spreading through the station seemed to suggest. She said her people preferred peace, valued it more than most species could probably imagine, precisely because peace had always been so rare and so hard-won on her world. But she said that peace, for humans, had never meant helplessness. It meant choosing not to fight, not being unable to. She said that the Codex had classified her species as fragile because it measured strength the way most of the galaxy measured it, in terms of technology, in terms of comfort, in terms of how far a species had traveled from the dangers of its own homeworld. She said that by that measure, humans probably did look fragile, arriving late among the stars, carrying simpler tools than most of the species already seated in that chamber. But she said fragility measured that way missed the only kind of strength that had actually mattered for most of human history. It missed the strength of a species that had clawed its way through storms and predators and diseases, with no advanced technology to shield them, no gentle world to soften the lessons, nothing but sheer stubborn will and the willingness to adapt faster than the dangers around them could adapt in return. She said humans had not been given safety. They had built whatever safety they had, generation after generation, out of nothing but persistence. The chamber was silent when she finished speaking. I watched the council representatives exchange glances, watched something shift behind their eyes, the same way it had shifted in our classroom the day the blade came out. It was the look of people realizing that a story they had accepted without question might have been incomplete all along. The council's decision came a week later. The Codex entry on humanity was formally revised, its flat, dismissive risk classification replaced with a longer, more careful description, one that spoke of resilience rather than mere fragility, of adaptability forged under conditions few other Codex species had ever faced. It was a small thing, a few lines of text in a vast interstellar database, but I understood, watching Autumn read the updated entry for the first time, that it meant something far larger to her than the words alone suggested. Life at the Academy changed after that, quietly but unmistakably. Students who had once whispered about Autumn now approached her with careful curiosity, asking real questions instead of trading in rumors. A few of Garrick's old friends, the ones who had laughed loudest at his jokes, avoided her entirely, embarrassment written plainly across their faces whenever she passed. Others, surprisingly, sought her out, drawn by the same fascination that had first drawn me, wanting to understand what kind of world could produce someone so calm in the face of something that had terrified an entire classroom. Autumn never became someone who enjoyed the attention. She remained quiet, careful with her words, more comfortable in the margins of a room than at its center. But something in her had loosened, slightly, in the weeks that followed the review. She smiled more easily. She let small pieces of her homeworld slip into ordinary conversation, not as a performance, but as something she was finally beginning to trust the rest of us to hear without turning it into a spectacle. One evening, weeks later, we sat together in the quiet courtyard where Garrick had once knocked her project out of her hands, the artificial sky above us shifting slowly into its programmed sunset colors. I asked her, finally, the question I had been holding on to since that very first day, the day I had watched her count exits instead of faces. I asked her what she missed most about her world, despite everything it had put her through. She thought about it for a long time before answering, longer than she usually took to answer anything. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it, stripped of the careful flatness she usually wore like armor. She said she missed the mornings. On her world, mornings meant you had survived another night, and there was a strange, fierce kind of gratitude in that, a feeling she said she had never quite found anywhere as safe as this station. She said safety was wonderful, and she did not regret coming here, did not regret the quiet nights and the predictable weather, and the absence of creatures built to see her as prey. But she said there had been something honest about her old life too, something that this new, softer world had not yet found a way to replace. She said that surviving something hard every single day had taught her exactly what she was capable of, and that most people here, safe and comfortable their whole lives, might never get the chance to learn that same lesson about themselves. I asked her if she thought that was a loss, growing up somewhere so gentle that you never had to find out how strong you really were. She looked at me for a long moment, and there was something almost sad in her expression, tangled together with something that looked a lot like hope. She said she hoped, for all our sakes, that we never had to. She said the price her world had paid to teach her that lesson was far too high to wish on anyone else, no matter what she had gained from surviving it. She said real strength was not something you should have to prove by nearly losing your life. It was something you carried quietly and hoped you never had to use. I thought about Garrick then, about the blade in his hand and the fear in his eyes when he finally understood, too late, exactly what he had underestimated. I thought about the whispers that had followed Autumn since her very first day, the assumptions we had all made about her, the word Deathworld sitting flat and cold on a page until it walked into our classroom and turned out to mean something far larger than any of us had understood. The lesson Autumn ended that day, the one Professor Lang never finished teaching because a blade interrupted it, was not really about survival strategies or cooperative defense systems or any of the things written into that afternoon's syllabus. It was a lesson about what strength actually looks like, quiet and patient and utterly unwilling to announce itself until the exact moment it was needed. I do not know what happened to Garrick after he left our academy. I do know that none of us who remained ever looked at fragility the same way again, and none of us ever mistook silence for weakness, not after watching someone who had survived a world built to kill her simply grin, and calmly, gently, end the lesson.